This is Sonic Ventures, a podcast celebrating the concept album format with Robert Goebel and Joël Tibbetts.
Sonic Ventures is an evolving series of discussions that explore concept albums from a variety of artists and genres. Our intent here is to have celebratory conversations of our personal experiences with selected works and the issues and themes surrounding concept albums.
Sometimes, we will be treading familiar waters concerning music interpretation and creation. Other times, we will venture into different places of thought, emotion, and expression. We invite you to join us on our sonic venture. Hello, Rob.
Hello, Joël.
It's a pleasure to be here with you again in Goebel Studios.
Yeah.
Although I don't know if you have a particular name for your...
Yeah, not named after myself, that's for sure. Yeah, I think it's still to be named. I've yet to come up. Yeah, I've yet to come up with something remotely clever. So I'll just
Do you want me to work on anything for you, or just leave it with you?
No, just leave it with me.
It'll appear.
I very much believe in the idea of emergence, and I'm sure it will emerge. I having left Studio B and Studio A at my previous residence, which was the same studio, but Studio B sometimes for bedroom, and Studio A because it was the primary recording space. So
right.
Depending upon how I felt about the day and what I was doing in there. It got to be, So this, I'm not quite sure what this is yet.
Well, as always, it's every time I come in here, there's a new layer of personality and reality. Some of it may be very symbolic, and some of it very literal.
Right.
But it's great. We're here doing our last episode for season 2.
Right, season 2, episode 8.
Yes.
And for really what's been a very interesting and rewarding season for us, fraught with all kinds of interesting life events and changes and some amazing discussions.
Yeah.
So it's really, really great to be here with you.
Yeah, and for anyone who's listening who hasn't really checked out the rest of what we've done, last season we ended with a conceptual approach of thinking about reflecting on the season and then talking about what we will be doing, however that emerges. So we wanted to maintain that, a little bit of that format, just I think mostly for ourselves.
Yeah.
But also because I actually found that to be really an interesting way to not only acknowledge what we've done, but how we've gone about this process of these conversations. And last episode from last season, we actually rushed to get it done because where we were going to record didn't happen.
Yeah.
And so I found that that was an interesting metric for where we were in our relationship of creating the podcast. It kind of added this extra little element at the end to say, okay, how committed are you, or how adaptive are you to this process?
Yeah. And what's interesting about that as well is that, you acknowledging that, we had been primarily recording at your office and music space at your house. And for some reason, we were unable to do so that day. So we'd sort of set up a couple of options where we could go record and get the episode done. So we were we were on new ground. We'd sort of checked out some spaces and thought that we would be able to pull it off. But once we got there, it just was not going to work. There was just way too much noise and way too much
electromagnetic craziness.
Oh yeah, there was all kinds of stuff going on, and we quickly, reorientated and tried another location. And that wasn't working either. Like the two ideas that we had, if I remember correctly, just weren't coming together. And the one idea was in the same space. Like we tried one office, and then quickly we tried to move to another part of the, and I think it even got worse at the second point. And was, could have, it sort of threatened the day, right? Like we've failed at this. We failed at recording a podcast, which is a really hard thing to fail at almost, we
have so much going for us technologically.
Yeah, we're carrying.
We must be able to make this happen.
I know we're carrying gear and mics and mic stands and all kinds of stuff, and and somehow we managed not to be able to do it. But I think at the last minute we thought, let's just go to the cafe, one of my cafes, and we had a room there that was an interesting room that we could close the door on, and we just decided to take the sort of informality of the environment that we were going to be in, which was a cafe. And although we could close the door, you could still hear that we were in a sort of a different space, an open environment. And there was something really poetic about having a conversation in a cafe where I have most of my conversations, so many conversations in my life have occurred in cafes as a cafe space, that there was just a very wonderfully poetic sort of coming togetherness of my past life with my present life and the podcast and the conversation, and the fact that, like you said, we just kind of we kind of went with it, and it actually I think turned out to be a better thing. Because I think we really leaned into it. Yeah, exactly. We were committed to seeing it through, and I think that was a really great way to end the season, because I think it informed us going into this season. We've gone to a lot of places we didn't in the first one. Right. In terms of the types of music we listened to, the eras of music we listened to, and then just the broadening of our relationships. So the topics of discussion. Right. And in terms of the albums, but also in terms of how they related to us personally. Sure. We really opened up a lot. And plus we started the Patreon. And the Aftercast. Yeah. So we doubled our output. We did. Yeah. But doubled our output seemingly to everyone else, but still probably not as much as we could talk about if we just kept on going. Right. Yeah. So, it's really great to be continuing this kind of approach of a reflective final episode, and of course also looking to the next season. Yeah. And on that note, one of the big things that I really was reflecting on about this season was just how much I learned and how much I explored, even if I knew the album. There was so many new things that I engaged with in this season that I honestly couldn't recall all of them if you asked me to do that right now. Yeah. But I just felt like there was a feeling of, when you were a kid and summer felt longer than it does now? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Like it was huge. It was immense, probably for a couple of reasons. One, just because of your age. Yeah. And your concept of time and space and what you do with your time. But then also just the fact that it was, at least for us in this society, it's a break point between the obligation of going to school. Yeah, yeah. And so I felt that there was a summer feeling for me throughout doing this season. Yeah. A very playful, explorational time, even when it was with albums like Gretchen Goes to Nebraska, The King's X, or The Iron Maiden, Seventh Son of a Seventh Son, or Bitches Brew. There was just all of these new things to engage with. It was very, very eye-opening for me in a sense in that way. Yeah. I echo the learning. This season has been just amazing in how much time we got to spend with albums, and already kind of like, we'll call it, is sort of already attuned to now doing the podcast. So like, we're sort of like not battle tested, but like we're road tested in that sense.
Right.
Like
we've got some chops for doing this.
Right. It's like we already learned how to now ride the bike. So now we're just riding the bike. Right.
Right.
And so that gave us a certain momentum coming into the season, as well as the excitement of, hey, looking back from that last episode of the first season that we did, that sort of like looking back and looking forward to the future. I mean, that really did give us that momentum coming into the season. And I think that momentum carried through the entirety of the season, despite several, real barriers and we'll call it disruptions to our timeline and our process that actually happened here, just from life events and personal events. And what I found really interesting about that is that it didn't change the momentum of and the excitement of the momentum and the feeling of moving through the season.
Right.
There you could say there was sort of a delayed gratification element maybe to some of it. But I was, really worried that it would disrupt it. And I'm pleased to say that, maybe a credit to you and to both of us in terms of our adaptive resources, but we weren't disrupted by that, and we were able to sort of get through the season on the same wave, riding that same wave.
Yeah, I feel that too, and I was thinking about that as well, and I think part of that is because, and correct me if I'm wrong for you, but I feel that we share this understanding that art or creativity, in terms of how they're, it's usually looked at, whether it's a form of art or a form of an activity, these things are not extra to life.
Right.
And these things are not conditional to life. They're embedded in it.
Yeah.
And so I think that you and I embody that. I mean, I think it came up in the podcast pretty soon, because I wondered, what's Rob going to say about this in his life? Or what am I going to say about this in my life? And then when it would present itself in the podcast, it actually informs that momentum, because making the podcast and the rest of our lives have a symbiotic relationship.
Right.
And it comes up in the podcast itself. I mean, obviously we don't get on and say, these are all the things that have happened to me since the last episode.
Right.
But we also have an attenuation to how, what has been said by some, that you put your life in your art, so to speak, and you put your art into your life.
Right.
And we live in a time right now, more so than I think than ever in human history, that the commodification and the idea of product and content with creativity we're so inundated with that, instead of it just being, this is something I do. So I think it goes back to that summer reference I was speaking of. You wake up as a kid, at least I did in the summer, and think, oh, what am I going to do today? Today's huge.
Yeah. It's
an open space. And then things would happen. And you don't get up the next day lamenting that yesterday you didn't do all the other things.
Right.
You come into the next day with, what's going to happen today? And I think that, at least I feel that we, in our own respective ways, have something of that spirit and that approach in what we do in our lives, and so it comes together in the podcast.
One of the ways to avoid the artifice of art, right, and this podcast is, a product of our creative venture together, and so it has an element of art to it, but to avoid the artifice of it is to vest it as much with our lived experience and realness as much of ourselves as we can.
Yeah.
And the importance of that being is that, the realer it is, and the more vested with how we live our lives and how we conduct ourselves in our lives and with music and with art, is that it offers other people, an opportunity to identify within that, and sort of opens the doors to them in ways that that's something that just stands as a piece of art or as a product doesn't. We're inviting you into these conversations,
right?
And we're trying to be as real with who we are, and who and our relationship as friends and as creators. We're keeping that door open because we think that in the way we talk about the music that we love, that enriches our experience.
Yeah.
And we're hoping that allows other people to sort of similarly get an enrichment that they might not otherwise have known they could get.
Yeah. Right now, I was just struck with the memory of the first time I learned about cave paintings that are about 60,000 years old. And thinking about why would anyone take the time to do that when they're trying to survive 60,000 years ago?
Right.
And then even the idea that these are deep in caves. So just as you were speaking about that invitation to come in and see the nuance of a lived experience, that imagery of going into a cave and finding those images, but then also realizing how long ago they were done. I just was struck with that image as you were talking about that. And I agree with you. I think that that's one of the beautiful things about what I have found for myself in this podcast is it having a creative outlet in the nature of just the conversation itself.
Right. And one thing to maybe address here is we may, as a listener, they may have just experienced a transition or an awkwardness in the conversation that suddenly seems a little different, and embracing the sort of real life element of what we do. Of course, while we're in the middle of conversation, the furnace here kicked on, and it's a furnace that I don't have control over because it's actually feeding somebody's residence in the floors above me, and this is the first time that's happened. And as we approach, I was going to say as we approach fall, but it didn't even happen before when we during the fall and spring that we were recording here. So. We're just kind of rolling with it. So, and anyone that you may or may not be hearing a little more background noise, but that this is a conversation that's occurring. In the lived lives of two dudes on mic, going, "What is that noise?" We got to roll with it.
Yeah, and rolling with that and what you were talking about before, I did have a question for you.
Okay, yeah.
About where you are with us having finishing up this season. I was very curious to ask you, is there anything that you identify with or recognize in your creative life that has been influenced or affected by our conversations? So basically what I'm asking you is the experience of creating the podcast affected your creativity throughout the rest of your life?
Absolutely. The process itself has, these conversations have been a product of my creative process, but they've also fed that process. They become a feedback loop unto themselves. So I'm doing many, many different creative things because of this podcast, from the energy of doing this podcast, from the inspiration of the music that we've been engaged with and talking about, it's hard to actually separate them, to sort of point to, this sort of exact thread or the exact thing that pushed everything. It's like turbocharged, I can't not be more creative as part of this. So the effect of doing these podcasts and having these conversations has been profound on all my creative endeavors.
That's great.
Without listing all the different projects, it's absolutely profound on them. And
same for me. Same for me. One thing in particular, though, that I have been, two things actually that I've been reflecting on now and then, with the very question that I asked you, is how by listening to all these different albums and the different ways that they move through time, I've been thinking a lot about transition, just in sound. How do you go from one thing to another? So when I was studying music composition, I remember one day there was a discussion about transition. How do you go from one thing to another? And my prof went to the blackboard and drew a very simple visual representation of, you either go from this to this, or you gradually go from one thing to another. That's it. There's no other options. It was almost like a physics moment, right? This is how it works, basically. And so what I have done throughout this season, listening to these albums, is just finding myself often reflecting on, how did they go, or how did that artist go from this to that? What choices did they make? And then the other thing that's been coming up for me a number of times through this season is just the idea of making use of what you have, instead of wondering how to get what you think you need. So when I think about Deltron 3030, Kate Bush, Hounds of Love, and then I contrast it with Iron Maiden, and for example, I could talk about how they had whatever means they had, but at the same time, there's something about what they did with what they had. If you understand what I'm getting at, is that Kate Bush is not desiring to be like Iron Maiden in terms of what they have, and Iron Maiden is not wanting to do what Deltron 30 did in terms of what they have. There's just these intuitive and rationalized ways of approaching things, and the idea of thinking that you don't have enough in the moment can at times compel you to problem solve, but sometimes it can really put up roadblocks. And so I found that by moving through these different albums, it just kind of was a nice reminder about being with what I have and really investing myself in it, in terms of whether it's the studio and the tech I'm using, or even just the concepts or ideas that are coming to me.
Right.
So, but at the same time, I would echo what you said about how there's really no distinction of having the podcast in my life and the other things that I'm doing. They all dovetail into one another.
The season itself, like one of the things, and we've talked about this as a process before, is that we afford ourselves the opportunity, and in some ways the privilege, of spending an enormous amount of time with each of these albums. Right? Yeah. Listens that go well beyond the dozens.
Right.
Like we're listens that are occurring usually over the course of at minimum 4 or 5 weeks.
Right.
Upwards of 2 months, 2.5 months.
Yeah.
And in reality, some of these albums a lifetime. That we've been listening to. So, with this sort of almost like embedded journalistic approach with these works of art that we kind of allow ourselves. It's very similar to touch on what you were just talking about. Like when you go to a modern art gallery, say, as opposed to a traditional gallery, and your exposure to this vast different array of art, that is the product of a creative process from all these different individual artists, and you sort of see that array.
Yeah.
Right. That's what, we experienced that this season in the array of artists that we listened to.
Yeah.
And one of the thoughts that is so inspiring about that is like you said, like each of these artists took what they had,
yeah,
and did this thing,
yeah,
and produced this wonderful thing, dramatically different from each other,
yeah,
and so the exposure to the multiplicity of possibility, of creative possibility, of what you can do with whatever you have or don't have, whatever your process was or is. Like we have a certain intimacy with knowing that so much is possible outside of whatever narrow focused or the limitations of our own experience at the time. So as we get into these works, we're bringing our experience to them. We've talked about that. But they are fundamentally opening us up to other experiences. We're like the world is opening up through this art in ways that is changing us, and educating us, and just revealing, just the scape. The vast scape of creative possibility.
And it's interesting you saying it, because I was thinking about how, as a thing, concept albums really haven't been around that long, but there's a lot of them.
Yeah.
There's a lot to explore, and there is that, like you said, there's that feeling of opening into worlds, and then when these albums mix, there's other worlds that come out of that. Right? There's just an incredible organic intermixture that happens.
Yeah.
So going from Kate Bush's Hounds of Love to Frank Sinatra and the Wee Small Hours, that in itself had a very interesting cross-pollinating effect for me.
Right, and the experience of going between those works, like if there was a takeaway that I hope people would gather from being listening to the podcast is that these things are possible. Like that, forget about what genre you like or what you listen to. Like this is really just taking these routes and making these connections or having these experiences. It's like travel. You visit one country, you go to another country, you go to another country.
I think that's a fair analogy.
They inform, the second country you visit informs you as much about the country you just left as the one you've still yet to go to, to the future country. So like, we've talked about the dialogic before and the sort of interactivity of utterances and ideas and thoughts. Well, that's happening here, and so what the enrichment that we're getting from these experiences of jumping between genres and artists that it's not just about the basic similarities and dissimilarities and like the experience is much more beyond that, and it really touches in very real human lived ways.
Right.
Like I'm having deeper access to myself through this process,
which in itself I find undoes the need for a taxonomy of how things are. So even like how we talked about King's X's Gretchen Goes to Nebraska, an album both of us listened to many, many, many times before we even decided to talk about it.
Right.
And then even my process through that, re-examining that album with the idea that we're going to have this conversation, led me to some new insights but it also breathed a whole new life into the album.
Yeah.
That I'm not going to listen to it the same way that I did before. It's not, it doesn't, and then the fact that it coexists in a canon of the second season with, Tyler the Creator, Igor album right after it. Mm-hmm. They suddenly have a relationship that before I wouldn't have had.
Yeah.
And I love that. I find it's a very, the organic nature of being genuine, at least for myself, about thinking about music instead of particular genres, or even go further, forget music, just sound and the experience of sound and how sound is in your life. Yeah, I think there's at least a 6-hour conversation in just that.
Well, yeah, with each work touching you and changing you fundamentally, you're the common element there, but that connectivity from each work through you to each other.
Yeah.
You're like the Kevin Bacon in the however many degrees of Kevin Bacon
separation.
There is, that connects Frank Sinatra.
6, isn't it?
I think 6 degrees of 6 degrees of
Kevin Bacon.
You are the Kevin Bacon that connects Igor to In the Wee Small Hours.
Okay, I'm with you up until a point. Because you use the word fundamental.
Okay.
I would just say, do we really know if it's Kevin Bacon or Kevin Sausage? Is it Kevin Charcuterie? Is it Kevin Omelette?
Right.
I think I totally agree with what you're saying, but I also think that what affects us fundamentally also has the potential for us to question what we are fundamentally. And it just and that I think echoes what the podcast has been for me to a certain degree, is that it has actually had me look at myself in ways I haven't before.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because you're right that it isn't actually about how those two albums connect to each other. It's really how they connect to you.
Right. And then who is you?
And who are you?
Yeah.
And you're not Kevin Bacon. Thankfully.
Last time
I don't think so. Yeah.
Not, but maybe tomorrow. There's the whole Taoist thing that I could wake up from a dream of being a butterfly, but then when I wake up, I think, well, wait a minute. Did I dream? Was I a human being dreaming of being a butterfly, or am I now a butterfly dreaming of being human?
Uh-huh.
And it goes on and on and on. One thing I wanted to touch on was the future.
Yeah, okay.
So to speak, that we try to construct and weigh as human beings. Going into thinking about season 3.
Yeah.
And there's 2 things that I'm very intrigued with about the upcoming season. And one of them we've kind of already touched on. I don't think we've touched on it in terms of being on mic. But it's the idea of soundtracks, which I totally believe ought to be in the conversation of concept albums.
Yeah.
And so I think there is some possibility that next season we'll be bringing that in, because you actually suggested, and I had put a couple soundtracks on my own lists that I thought would be worthwhile.
Yeah.
For the podcast, and so I've actually been, that has been an exciting area that I've been spending a little bit more time thinking about.
Right. Yeah. I think this is a great opportunity just to sort of say, yes, there will be a season 3.
There's that. Yeah, we could start there.
There is a season 3 in the works, and both Joël and I are very excited about the idea of it. And yeah, I think that it's not that we've had the door closed to soundtracks. We just hadn't done a soundtrack yet.
It's come up, but we haven't brought it into the mix yet.
Yeah,
literally.
So we're looking at expanding, the reach of what we do and the definition of and our understanding of concept albums. And you explore the obvious. We started with the obvious, right?
Yeah, and we didn't feel weighted down by earning our legitimacy by doing all the obvious.
Yeah.
And then we can, this is, it's that thing about Beethoven saying, I want to learn the rules so I can break them.
Yeah.
Me, it's like, I wouldn't mind breaking them while I'm learning them.
Yeah.
So there's
Nice.
that. The whole thing about soundtracks, I'm very excited about that. But the other thing is I've actually been pooling about 3 or 4, I'm up to maybe 5 albums that aren't designated as concept albums.
Well,
but I think they ought to be in the conversation.
Yeah, I think one of our first episode in the first season is what is a concept album, which is in some ways
the conversation.
It's the meta question for the whole series. For each season, what that question hangs there, and really just as an opportunity to explore it.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not a question that we're definitively trying to answer. It's one that's indulging our ability to explore it.
Right. We're exploring something that's considered to be fundamental, and at the same time, it comes into what we consider to be fundamental of ourselves.
Yeah.
So we touched on it a bit. In season 1, we talked about 2112.
Yeah.
It needed to come into the conversation just because of its relationship in our lives and how it formed, at least for me, the venturing into concept album territory.
Right.
So we've already kind of, bent the linearity of the idea that we're talking about concept albums.
Yeah.
But there's a few of them that I think bear a real attention in terms of what is a concept album and what isn't.
Yeah, well, in my morning coffee vinyl side project where I play these vinyl albums with my morning coffee and I post them on Instagram.
Well, by the way, congratulations on being probably one of the most earnest and devoted podcasts would be. What would that be? What would you call the vinyl side? Is it like a daily essay?
Yeah, it's
journal.
It's kind of a daily. I've called them write-ups, but they're not. They're kind of like an oral essay.
Because you've done them every single day without missing a day for what?
About a year and a half now.
Yeah. Like, well done.
Thank you, sir. Yeah,
it's very impressive.
But every morning with my morning coffee, we play a vinyl album from initially the collection of my grandparents and my parents, albums that we'd inherited and had been in the closet for 30 years sort of thing. And just with the idea, very similar to what we do is, I want to hear music and these vinyl albums all had, musical treasures on them that were not being heard because they weren't being played.
Right.
And so, morning coffee being a time of the day where I'm drinking my morning coffee, playing these albums, just has, over the year and a half that I've been doing this, given me this sort of like unintended, but this access to and an experience of traveling through really the history of the evolution of the album period, of the LP.
Right.
So far, I've just been playing LPs, and from the days, like the very early days of the LP, because these records go back, to grandparents and stuff, and so my exposure to what defines an album as a thing unto itself, because initially, because of format limitations, albums were short. Maybe, and singles were, you could consider them singles, were a function of like shorter formats and economic things, in terms of. But at some point, the album as a thing developed, and so the album as a thing already had a concept behind it. Yeah, like from the very beginning, every album in a way is a concept album. You could argue, But and then seeing how quickly these thematic organizations, stated or unstated, seem to sort of be embodied within these album presentations.
Right.
Really problematized my succinct or specific understanding that even though we've totally opened up that conversation to ourselves, I still carried with me about what a concept album was.
Right.
So that, so like you, that question is as active and even more active maybe today. And my own propensity or my own sort of proclivity to open the door wider to and really get into albums and concept albums as is very, very much there. Like I'm very ready to do that, to open that door wider, because like it's just happened as a byproduct of these daily album plays.
Right.
And so now it's almost to the point where it's easier for me to decide something isn't a concept album if it isn't, versus if it is, because they all could be unless I rule them out, sort of thing. It's, right. It happened pretty quick. It seems like within the very introduction. I mean, we saw this with Sinatra.
Yeah.
One of the first LPs.
That's right.
Right.
And
a concept album at the same time. And, there's a bit of a chicken and egg argument, as to, and there's a few academic distinctions about timing for, when LPs came out and what have you. But really,
but what I find about those arguments is that they're often due to a mindset of a need for reproduction.
Yeah.
And what I find really exciting about the podcast is that we don't know where it's going.
Yeah, and also the concrete versus the abstract, right? Like, some people really need to have a definitive answer to a question.
Yes, that's true.
And we're looking for questions with the excuse to go wandering.
Yes.
Right? And in fact, like if I have a definitive answer, I don't need to leave the house, right? What's out there,
Then there's also the piece about better questions, which you could argue, what even is that?
Yeah.
And I think the word wandering is a very, very good one for at least what I found our style or approach to doing the podcasts are. But I think it's also very much how we look at life itself. We had a conversation off mic not too long ago about that very thing.
Yeah.
And I think another thing that has really grown inside me with doing these episodes with you is the incredibly profound and powerful attitude of creating with a spirit of exploration and experimentation.
Yeah.
And really staying with that and not getting hung up on maybe some of the things that come at me from the society around me that may say that it's more important that you think about perhaps the economics or the reach. How many people have heard this or how many people understand it or what have you. That idea that, it's like Da Vinci's notebooks, that there's something deeper going on or another kind of expansiveness that is happening beyond what you see in particular works. The notebooks, Da Vinci's notebooks are not just, they're not about how to do it. They're the inspiration to do. They're the inspiration to explore, to experiment, to question, to wander, to get lost, to problem solve for things that seem very personal to you, but you invest yourself in them. You can make some of that out to be how we went through the podcast this year.
Yeah.
Of just carry on, keep going.
Yeah.
And the idea, I think, of the concept album as as a mindset, if you will. We've seen so many different iterations of it already, and we've hardly reached. I can't even give a number to. I don't know what the number would be, or the ratio of where we are as to what is out there and what is happening. But I think that the idea of the concept album is very much often like the issue with the quantum states. The moment you interact with it, it does something.
Right.
But it's doing it because you're interacting with it.
Right.
So what is it? And what is that interaction? And so again, I think that comes back to the wandering idea, the explorational idea. And I'm very, very, very intrigued by what we'll be doing next. Like even the first conversation, we haven't talked about it.
No.
We don't know what we're going to do first. I haven't started thinking about exactly what I'm going to propose for episodes. But I did actually have a little bit of a listening break.
Yeah.
For a couple of weeks. The only thing I would listen to is very drony, ambient background, so to speak, kind of music. You know, like Eno, or maybe well, sometimes I have my own little patches I made with pads and just taking a break from the kind of active listening that we've been doing.
Yeah.
But I can already feel a surge of I want to actively listen again.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I can honestly say I've never been more enthusiastically excited and open to exploring music than I am right now. I'm so excited and to find and listen to and experience life as I listen to music.
That's a great way to put it.
These repeated listens and all this exposure that we've had has developed into a soundtrack that is sort of playing as I'm living, and whether I'm listening in the moment, sometimes, I've got the headphones on and I'm working or I'm doing my thing, or I can't turn it off. So I'm walking with this idea or this feeling of hearing music as a soundtrack as I'm going about my life, in a way that I always kind of did a little bit, but just a much broader and richer tableau of that. And then when I encounter things that move me or capture my attention for whatever reason, the excitement is so immediately palpable right now in a way that like I'm not resistant to it. Like when I was younger, I could be resistant to genres or certain stylistic things. There was some built-in resistance and prejudice there, and I just feel so much of that is stripped away.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and
that's great.
Some of that is a function of playing like really obscure, sort of maritime fiddle music. But
I had a moment the other day in the garden.
Yeah.
I'm a very big fan of birdsong.
Okay.
And there was a moment where there was just a melody that came out, and I thought, that sounds like something Tyler the Creator might do. And when I had that moment, it kind of put me in the mindset you just presented right now, is that I from the very beginning of my life and with music, it's been a diversity. Of course, that diversity has changed.
Yeah.
Right? It's opened up more and more and more, but it's also because I've wanted it to.
Yeah.
And in the moment that I had with this bird song and this association with Tyler, I actually quickly went and thought to myself, I would not have had that insight if everything that's happened hadn't happened.
Yeah.
So there's nothing for me to regret. There's nothing for me to feel anxious about in terms of what has happened. And there's even less evidence for me to be anxious about what will happen.
Right.
And I feel that one of the, I think maybe I alluded to it earlier in this conversation, one of the things that I've really appreciated about this podcast is stepping into something that already feels like it was alive. It was already there. You know, like when we first connected, and there were so many things that we connected on right away.
Yeah.
And it's just been, I have to say, for doing this podcast, it's been a great piece of evidence, but also a reminder that when things go well, there are good reasons, but you don't have to know what they are.
Right.
Just go with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm very grateful. And because I'm carrying the riches of this experience with me. I'm really feeling the inspiration. You know, your opening question about what is this inspired? Well, the real answer to that is like everything, right? Like I can't turn it off, and I can't necessarily even separate it into categories.
Yeah.
You know, it's
so a wonderful soupy feeling.
It's and one of the wonderful things about the podcast for us that we've recently connected to some listeners, and a friend of the podcast has reached out to us several times to share their experience with the podcast, but not the podcast specific, like it, because what this person revealed to us was how it became a catalyst for their own sort of explorations and so, you know, as they journeyed sort of through our experiences with these albums and used sort of the opportunity to get into the albums themselves from the podcast, it just opened up doors for them in their own life and their own creative process. And so, you know, to see that someone else sort of got the spirit of the discussions and our own journey, and it sort of inspired, what for them sounds like a very almost sacred personal journey of their own exploration through music and life. And I mean, that kind of feedback and that kind of experience is like, I couldn't imagine a better outcome or a better result of doing something like, just to have to be able to have participated in somebody being able to do that on their own journey is just, I mean, just massive.
I don't know if I actually said this on mic, but that would be in line with my view of stoking unknown fires.
Yeah.
You know, the if you say to someone it's worth doing and they say why, and then you say, I don't know, that is why.
Yeah.
I think you know that I feel in the spirit a lot of what we're doing. And I'm with you on that. It's amazing when those kinds of connections and those relational elements emerge.
Yeah, I'm very I'm just in awe of that. In awe of someone else's journey, and this is our journey, and this part of this has been our journey and a shared journey and stuff. But just the interconnectedness of all that, and people going off and forging their own pathways through music and through these works and through life and how it connects to them. I mean, that's like a rolling ball down the hill. That's the whole fractal element of this experience, as the experience sort of it fractally reproduces itself and connects to other people and other experiences. I mean, it's everything that I would have hoped it would be without having hoped it would be that, like
I think that's a good way to proceed into season 3.
I think so too. I think we're doing really well.
Well, this has been another great conversation. And as you've said, and I'm sure it's coming off in other things I've said, I'm very grateful for what we've journeyed through together.
Yeah.
And I also love how there's that respective journeying and then coming together. I think there's a kind of depth and sincerity to that I really appreciate having in my life. And I'm really looking forward to the next season. Yeah.
And we're going to take a bit of a break, but not a crazy long break.
We have to kind of feel our way to that. But it's not going to be a year or something like that. No. Well, we'll venture on. And hey, just like the title. We'll definitely be doing a season 3. And as always, we're going to be aiming for 8 episodes.
Yeah, and right now, are we probably looking at the same time period, the sort of end of October, beginning November? Yeah,
I think it's worth aiming for.
Yeah,
and we'll I think we'll keep the same kind of attempt to keep the same regime, because it's like it's our working model.
Yeah, and hopefully. Although life does always throw challenges in front of you, that we want to keep a relatively predictable schedule that allows us to present the episodes sort of monthly or so every
that was
4 or 5
what
weeks
we established, and I think it's what we've endeavored to sustain as best we can. But as you mentioned earlier on, artistry and artifice. Life's messy, and that's beautiful. Yeah.
Well, and this has been beautiful.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Joël.
Thank you, Rob.
Yeah, and thanks to everyone that's enjoyed.
Thanks to people who've listened to the podcast and gotten in touch with us.
Yeah.
But just listen to it, and I am certainly pleased that there's fires out there that I'll never see the light of.
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. And there will be no aftercast.
Yes, there's no aftercast
for this episode. But the aftercasts have been great and available on our Patreon account.
That's right.
Yeah. So we should wrap up. We're trying to wrap up. I keep circling back. So
we're wrapping. Like when you first learn to wrap a present. We're kind of doing that. We're wrapping it like, no, let's try it again. Okay, here we go. Here's a wrap. Thanks, Rob. It's been a great season, and I look forward to the next one.
Thank you as well, Joël.